He bought a flooded farm well below market value and on credit, hoping to make a quick profit. But one barn survived the flood and was completely covered with dry sand. When he started digging, it became clear that it wasn't the harvest that was hidden there. See how this deal ended? Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Tom learned about the farm the way people usually learn about opportunities that are too good to be true, through a short, careless line buried deep in a listings page, posted late at night and already marked as urgent. The price caught his attention first, not the photographs, not the brief description, not even the red warning note about flood damage. $22,000 for land that large, with a house and multiple outbuildings, was not a bargain. It was an insult to common sense. In the county where he had spent most of his adult life, you could not buy an empty lot for that money, let alone a place that still had walls standing and a road leading to it. He stared at the number for a long time, refreshing the page as if expecting it to correct itself. It didn't. The price stayed where it was, blunt and unapologetic, like someone daring a fool to take it seriously. Tom felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the mixture of excitement and calculation that had driven him into trouble before. He told himself he was older now, more careful. But the truth was that numbers still spoke louder to him than warnings. Numbers promised solutions. Numbers promised exits. The description was sparse. Flooded farmland, structural damage, sold as is, bank-owned, quick close preferred. There was no story, no attempt to soften the edges. That alone told him more than any polished sales pitch could have. The bank wanted it gone. It was a problem they were tired of carrying on their books, an asset that had stopped pretending to be an asset the moment the river overflowed its banks. Tom leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, already running calculations. If the land could be cleaned and resold, even at half its former value, the return would be substantial. If the buildings were beyond saving, the materials alone might cover the loan, and if there was anything left behind by the previous owner, anything overlooked in the rush to abandon the place after the flood, then the deal would turn from risky to brilliant. He had learned long ago that desperation made people careless, and floods had a way of erasing not only structures, but memories. He did not tell himself he was buying a home. He told himself he was buying time. Time to recover from the years that had hollowed him out, from the failed venture that had left his name sour with lenders, from the quiet end of a marriage that had run out of patience for his schemes. He had promised himself that the next move would be the one that set everything straight. This farm looked like the kind of move that could do exactly that. The next morning, he called the number listed beneath the ad. A woman answered, her voice flat and efficient, as if she had already learned not to hope for enthusiasm on the other end. She explained the basics without embellishment. The farm had been seized after the owner defaulted on his loan. Insurance claims had been denied due to pre-existing issues. The flood had only accelerated what was already falling apart. The bank was open to offers, but preferred a fast transaction. There would be no repairs, no guarantees, no second chances. Tom asked a few careful questions, enough to sound cautious, but not enough to invite hesitation. He scheduled a visit for the following day. When he hung up, he felt the old spark of anticipation settle into his bones, sharp and energizing. He ignored the quieter voice that reminded him how often that same feeling had led him to misjudge risks. The drive to the farm took longer than he expected. The road narrowed as it left the highway, twisting through low ground, where water still lingered in shallow pools beside the asphalt. The land bore the scars of the flood openly. Fences leaned at odd angles. Fields lay stripped and dull, and debris clung to trees like remnants of some forgotten struggle. As he turned onto the gravel path that led to the property, his tires crunched through mud that had not yet fully dried, sending a faint vibration through the steering wheel. The house came into view first, a modest structure that had once been painted white, but now wore a patchwork of stains and exposed wood. The lower walls were darkened, swollen where water had seeped in and stayed long enough to leave its mark. Windows were intact but dull, clouded by residue that no amount of rain would wash away. The place looked tired, not ruined, but far from welcoming. Tom stepped out of the truck and stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. There was no movement, no distant hum of machinery or voices. The farm felt abandoned in a way that went beyond vacancy, as if it had already been dismissed by the world around it. He walked toward the house, noting the uneven ground, the way the soil gave slightly under his boots. This land would need work, more than he had initially hoped, but work could be managed. Work could be outsourced, delayed, repackaged. He circled the house without entering. He was not here to fall in love with it. He was here to assess how much of it could be turned into something else. The doors were warped but closed. The roof sagged slightly at one corner. The porch steps creaked under his weight, a sound that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet air. He made mental notes and moved on. The outbuildings stood farther back, clustered loosely as if they had grown where they were needed, rather than where they were planned. A small shed had collapsed entirely, its roof lying in the grass like a discarded lid. A barn leaned to one side, its boards split and stained. Another structure, smaller and lower, had lost part of its siding, revealing a dark interior cluttered with debris. Tom walked past them with only brief glances. Damage like that was expected. It fit the story he had already accepted. Then he saw the last building. The barn stood slightly apart from the others, closer to a shallow rise in the land. It wasn't large, but it was solid in a way the rest were not. Its walls were straight. Its roofline was even. The wood looked weathered, but not broken. The doors were shut, their hinges intact, their surfaces dry enough to show grain rather than rot. Compared to the surrounding destruction, it looked almost untouched. Tom slowed without realizing it. He told himself the barn had simply been built better, placed on higher ground, spared by chance. Floods were uneven that way. They punished some things brutally and ignored others altogether. Still, something about the contrast unsettled him. The barn did not belong in this picture. It was too intact, too quiet. He approached it cautiously, placing a hand against one of the doors. The wood felt firm beneath his palm, not soft or swollen. He pulled lightly. The door did not budge. It was locked, not jammed. That detail caught his attention more than anything else. Locked buildings on abandoned properties usually meant one of two things. Either someone intended to return, or someone had wanted to keep something inside. Tom smiled despite himself. This was the kind of detail he liked, the kind that hinted at possibilities. He stepped back and looked around, taking in the layout of the land again, this time with a sharper eye. The barn's position was deliberate. It sat just high enough to avoid standing water, close enough to the road to access easily, but far enough from the house to remain unnoticed. He did not try to force the door, not yet. He wanted to see the rest of the property first, to keep his expectations in check. He spent another hour walking the perimeter, noting the boundaries, the condition of the soil, the way the river curved in the distance. Everywhere he looked, there was evidence of loss, of water that had taken what it wanted and left behind what it couldn't carry. Everywhere, except that barn. When he finally met with the bank's representative later that afternoon, the conversation was brief and impersonal. Papers were reviewed. Terms were restated. There was no attempt to negotiate beyond the price already set. Tom sensed that pushing too hard might make the bank reconsider, might remind them that the land still held some value. He accepted the terms as they were, nodded at the warnings, signed where indicated. The loan was approved with a speed that should have alarmed him. $19,000, secured against the property itself, with a short repayment window and interest rates that reflected the bank's confidence that he would either succeed quickly or fail completely. Tom handed over his $3,000 without hesitation. It was the last of his savings, but he told himself it was only temporary. Money moved. It always did. As he drove away with copies of the documents on the passenger seat, he felt a strange mix of relief and resolve. The deal was done. The farm was his. He did not think about the implications of that word, did not imagine mornings spent repairing fences or nights listening to wind move through empty buildings. Ownership to him was not about belonging. It was about leverage. He returned to the farm the next day alone. This time, he went straight to the barn. The lock yielded easily to a set of tools he had brought with him, a simple mechanism that suggested it had been meant more as a barrier than a defense. When the door opened, it did so smoothly, without the groan of warped wood or rusted hinges. What greeted him was not what he expected. The interior was filled with sand, pale and dry, rising almost to the level of the roof beams. It lay in smooth, deliberate slopes, undisturbed, as if it had been poured and left to settle. There was no debris mixed into it, no traces of straw or feet or equipment, just sand, clean and silent, occupying a space that should have held tools or animals or nothing at all. Tom stood at the threshold for a long time, his initial excitement fading into confusion. Sand was worthless. Sand was everywhere. It was the last thing anyone would bother to hide. And yet, as he stepped inside and let the door close behind him, he felt a faint, creeping doubt take hold. This was not the sand left behind by a flood. Floodwater carried silt, trash, fragments of lives uprooted and scattered. This sand was dry beneath his boots. It did not smell of river or rot. It shifted softly, evenly, like something that had been placed with intention. He knelt and let it run through his fingers. It was fine, uniform, the kind used for construction or filtration, not the coarse mix dragged in by water. He straightened slowly, his mind already turning, already searching for explanations that aligned with profit rather than caution. Someone had brought this sand here. Someone had filled the barn deliberately, and people did not go to that kind of effort without a reason. As he stepped back out into the daylight, closing the door behind him, Tom felt the shape of his purchase change in his mind. The farm was no longer just damaged land at a bargain price. It was a question. One he had paid dearly to ask, and one he could not yet afford to ignore. Tom returned to the barn early the next morning, carrying nothing more than a shovel, a flashlight, and the quiet confidence of a man who believed that patience could always be converted into profit. The image of the sand-filled interior had stayed with him through the night, not as a mystery, but as an irritation. Sand meant work. Sand meant time. Sand meant disappointment. Yet it also meant intent, and intent almost always left something behind. The air was cool when he unlocked the door again, cooler than the rest of the farm, as if the barn preserved its own small climate. When he stepped inside, the silence pressed in around him, thicker than it had been the day before. The sand lay exactly as he had left it, smooth and pale, its surface unbroken. No settling, no collapse, no damp patches where moisture might have crept in overnight. It looked less like debris and more like a finished surface, as though someone had stopped in the middle of a task and never returned to complete it. He pushed the shovel into the sand and felt resistance immediately. Not the resistance of packed earth, but something firmer than loose grains should have offered. He leaned his weight into the handle, twisting slightly, and the sand gave way in a controlled slide rather than a spill. It moved, as if it had learned how to stay in place. Tom paused and studied the cut he had made. The edges were clean. The layers beneath were visible, faint variations in color and texture stacked carefully atop one another. This was not a single dumping. It was accumulation, deliberate and repeated. He began to dig in earnest, setting aside the top layer and pushing deeper. The work was harder than he had expected. Each shovel full carried weight, and the fine grains clung to his clothes and skin, finding their way into the seams of his gloves, the cuffs of his sleeves. Dust rose with every movement, dry and persistent, coating his throat and forcing him to stop more than once to cough and clear his lungs. As he worked, his irritation shifted slowly into something else. Curiosity at first, then a growing sense of unease. The deeper he went, the more obvious it became that the sand had been maintained. The layers were not random. Some were more compact, others looser, as if adjusted to accommodate something beneath them. He found traces of wooden planks embedded horizontally, old and worn but not rotted, arranged in a way that suggested they had been laid down intentionally and then covered. By midday, sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool air. His hands ached, raw where the gloves had worn thin. He straightened and stretched, his back protesting sharply. This was not the quick inspection he had imagined. Whatever lay beneath the sand, if anything did at all, had been buried with care. He stepped outside for water, squinting against the light. The rest of the farm lay unchanged, broken and quiet. The river glinted in the distance, swollen but calm, as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened here. He drank slowly, letting the water cool his throat, and considered his options. He could walk away, close the barn, list the property again, cut his losses before the loan began to tighten around him. No one would blame him. Sand was sand. There was no promise hidden in it. But the thought of leaving made his stomach tighten. He had not come this far to accept a dead end. He had paid for this question, paid more than he could afford, and he needed an answer. He went back inside. The afternoon passed in steady labor. Tom dug until his arms trembled, and his breath came shallow, stopping only when the pain in his hands forced him to. He worked methodically, widening the cleared area, probing the base of the barn where the sand met the floor. There, beneath the lowest layer, he found something that made him freeze. The floor was not bare earth. It was lined with compacted clay, smoothed and sealed, its surface cracked in places, but intact. Water had not reached it. Water could not have reached it without leaving a mark, and yet there was none. The clay formed a shallow basin, a barrier that explained everything the sand alone could not. This barn had been designed to stay dry. Tom sat back on his heels, breathing hard, his pulse loud in his ears. The flood had passed around this place, not through it. The sand had not been washed in. It had been brought here, layer by layer, protected from the very disaster that had destroyed the rest of the farm. As the realization settled in, so did a faint, unwelcome chill. This was not clever construction. It was concealment. He stood slowly and wiped his hands on his pants, leaving pale streaks behind. His initial excitement flickered back to life, sharper now, edged with caution. Concealment implied value, but it also implied intent, and intent implied people who might not appreciate discovery. That evening, Tom drove into town for supplies. The hardware store was nearly empty, its shelves still unevenly stocked after the flood. He bought more tools than he needed, justifying the expense with the thought that he could always resell them later. As he paid, the clerk glanced at the mud on his boots and asked casually where he was working. "The old farm by the river," Tom replied, watching the man's expression carefully. The clerk's smile faded, just slightly, just enough to notice. He nodded once, non-committal, and said nothing more. The transaction ended in silence, the receipt handed over without another word. Outside, Tom paused, unsettled. It was a small thing, easily dismissed, but it added to the weight pressing against his thoughts. He drove back as the sun dipped low, the sky turning dull and heavy, clouds gathering again on the horizon. That night, he dreamed of sand shifting under his feet, of ground giving way to reveal nothing but more layers, deeper and deeper, endless and suffocating. He woke before dawn with his jaw clenched and his heart racing, the taste of dust still sharp in his mouth. The next day, he returned to the barn with renewed determination. He worked longer, pushing himself past comfort, past sense. The dust thickened, hanging in the air like fog. His lungs burned, his hands blistered. More than once, he considered stopping, telling himself that whatever lay beneath was not worth this kind of effort. But each time, the image of the clay-lined floor and the untouched walls pulled him forward. By late afternoon, he uncovered another layer of planks, newer than the first, set carefully and covered completely. Whoever had done this had returned again and again, adjusting, reinforcing, maintaining. This was not the work of someone in a hurry. This was the work of someone committed. As the light began to fade, Tom felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over him. He leaned on the shovel, breathing shallowly, the edges of his vision darkening. The air inside the barn felt thicker than before, the dust heavier. He took a step toward the door, then another, forcing himself to keep moving until he stumbled out into the open and collapsed onto the grass. He lay there for several minutes, staring up at the sky, chest heaving. When the world steadied, he pushed himself up slowly, shaken by how close he had come to passing out alone in a building no one else visited. The thought lingered with him as he locked the barn and walked back to the house. That night, as he cleaned the dust from his skin and bandaged his hands, Tom found himself thinking less about profit and more about effort, about the amount of time and energy someone had poured into filling that barn with sand, about the discipline it took to maintain it, even after floods, even after everything else had fallen apart. Sand, he realized, was not the thing being hidden. Sand was the method. The barn stood outside his window, a dark silhouette against the dim light of the rising moon. It looked unchanged, indifferent to his presence, as if it had always been there and always would be. Tom lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, listening to the distant sound of the river and the nearer sound of his own breathing. He had come to the farm expecting damage and decay, expecting to measure loss in boards and soil. Instead, he had found resistance, not from nature, but from design. Whatever lay beneath that sand had survived not because it was lucky, but because someone had made sure it would. And for the first time since signing the papers, Tom wondered whether the cheap deal he had been so eager to make had bought him more than land and debt. It had bought him a history that refused to stay buried, and a question that would not let him rest until it was answered. Tom woke with the taste of dust still clinging to his mouth, and the ache of effort settled deep into his arms and shoulders. The barn occupied his thoughts before he even opened his eyes, not as an image, but as a weight, a presence that had followed him into sleep and refused to stay there. He lay still for a moment, listening to the house creak softly as it adjusted to the morning temperature, and tried to convince himself that curiosity alone did not justify the unease that had taken root in him. He had bought a damaged farm, nothing more. Whatever he was uncovering belonged to the past, and the past had no claim on him unless he allowed it. But as he dressed and stepped outside, the quiet of the place pressed in with a different quality than before. It was not the emptiness of abandonment that unsettled him now, but the sense of something withheld. The farm did not feel forgotten. It felt avoided. He drove into town with a purpose he had not admitted to himself the night before. Digging alone had brought him to the edge of understanding, but not beyond it. To go further, he needed context, and context lived in people. He told himself he would ask simple questions, the kind that did not invite suspicion. He would listen more than he spoke. He would gather fragments and assemble them later, privately. The diner on Main Street had reopened only a week earlier, its windows still bearing faint water lines that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. Inside, the air smelled of grease and disinfectant, a combination meant to reassure and distract. A few locals sat scattered among the booths, their conversations low and guarded, as if the walls themselves might be listening. Tom took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee. The woman behind the register recognized him, or at least recognized the look of someone not from here. She poured without comment and slid the mug toward him, her eyes flicking briefly to his hands, still marked by raw patches and faint cuts. "You working cleanup?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Something like that," Tom replied. He waited a beat, then added casually, "Bought the old farm by the river." The effect was immediate, though subtle. The woman's movements slowed. Her gaze lingered on him for a fraction longer than before. She nodded once, then turned away, busying herself with wiping an already clean surface. "That place has been trouble for a long time," she said at last, not looking at him. "What kind of trouble?" Tom asked. She shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both dismissal and restraint. "Depends who you ask." He let the question rest. Pressing too hard would close doors, not open them. Instead, he sipped his coffee and listened, letting the rhythm of the diner settle into him. When the woman returned to refill his mug, he asked another question, softer this time. "Did the flood hit it bad?" "Bad enough," she said, "like everything else. But one of the barns made it through," Tom said lightly. "Better than the rest, anyway." Her hand paused mid-pour. She set the pot down slowly. "Did it?" she said, her voice flat. Tom nodded as if confirming a minor detail. Seemed odd, that's all. She met his eyes then, and what he saw there was not fear, but fatigue. The look of someone who had answered these questions before and learned nothing good came of it. "You'd be better off focusing on the land," she said. "That's what matters now." She moved away, ending the exchange as cleanly as she had begun it. Tom paid and left, the silence following him out into the street. The conversation had given him no facts, no dates, or names, but it had confirmed something more important. The farm was not just another casualty of the flood. It carried a reputation, one that people had learned to handle carefully. He drove next to a neighboring property, a modest spread with a house that showed signs of recent repair. The man who answered the door was older, his posture stiff, his eyes sharp despite the years. He listened as Tom introduced himself, then leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You're the one who bought that place," the man said. "I am." "Why?" Tom considered his answer. Honesty would not serve him here, neither would deflection. "Seemed like a good deal," he said. The man snorted softly. "Deals always do." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Tom asked, "Did you know the previous owner?" The man's jaw tightened. Everyone knew him. That doesn't mean much. "Did he use that barn for livestock?" Tom asked. "No." "Storage?" "No." "What did he use it for?" The man's eyes shifted briefly toward the river. "You'd have to ask him." "I can't," Tom said. "He's gone." "So is a lot of what used to be," the man replied. Tom tried a different approach. "I noticed sand inside, a lot of it." At that, the man straightened, his expression hardening. "You shouldn't be digging around in there." "I own the place. That doesn't mean you understand it." Tom felt a flicker of irritation. I'm just trying to figure out what I bought." The man sighed, the sound heavy with years. "Some things don't improve with figuring." He stepped back, signaling the end of the conversation. Tom stood there a moment longer, then turned away, the man's words echoing in his mind. Ownership did not grant understanding, it only granted access. By the time he returned to the farm, his resolve had sharpened into something colder. The reluctance he had encountered was not random, it was shared, practiced. People had learned what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. That afternoon, Tom drove to the county records office, a squat building that smelled faintly of mold and paper. The flood had spared it, but just barely. Files were stacked unevenly, some marked with red tags indicating damage or loss. A clerk directed him to a computer terminal and left him alone to search. He started with property records, tracing ownership back through the years. The farm had changed hands infrequently, passed from one owner to the next in a steady line until it reached the man who had lost it to the bank. That man had held it longer than anyone else, nearly 3 decades. During that time, there were no major improvements listed, no expansions or renovations. On paper, the place had barely changed. Tom dug deeper, expanding his search to include zoning changes, business permits, environmental reports. That was where the pattern began to emerge. Years ago, an industrial operation had existed less than a mile from the farm, officially classified as a processing facility. Its records were thin, its closure abrupt. Several complaints had been filed during its operation, mostly related to noise and waste. Then there was a gap. No closure report, no environmental cleanup, just a note indicating that operations had ceased following severe flooding in the area. Tom leaned back in his chair, his eyes burning from hours of staring at the screen. Floods, he thought again. Always floods. Convenient moments when paperwork went missing, when damage obscured evidence, when attention shifted elsewhere. He searched for employee records, missing persons, anything that might connect the dots. There were a few names, scattered reports of workers who had left town abruptly or failed to return after seasonal layoffs. Nothing conclusive. Nothing that had ever resulted in charges. As the office closed around him, Tom printed what he could and gathered his notes. The pieces were incomplete, but the outline was there. Something had happened near this land. Something people had chosen not to remember. Back at the farm, he spread the papers across the kitchen table, the house creaking softly as evening settled in. The barn loomed outside the window, dark and still. He looked at it differently now, no longer as a puzzle to be solved for profit, but as a container for a story that had been deliberately buried. That night, as rain began to fall again, light and steady, Tom lay awake, listening to it drum against the roof. He thought of the neighbors' averted gazes, the clerk's hesitation, the gaps in the records. He thought of the sand, layered and maintained, long after the rest of the farm had been left to decay. People did not invest that kind of effort in nothing. They invested it in silence. By morning, the rain had eased, leaving the ground slick and dark. Tom stepped outside and breathed in the damp air, feeling the weight of his decision settle more firmly on his shoulders. He could stop now, list the property again, blame the flood, the debt, his own miscalculation. Walk away before the loan payments tightened and the questions grew louder. Instead, he turned toward the barn. Whatever lay beneath the sand was no longer just a curiosity. It was the reason people had learned not to remember. And Tom, having paid for the privilege of asking, found that he could no longer accept their silence as an answer. The rain stopped before dawn, leaving the farm wrapped in a heavy stillness that felt earned rather than accidental. Tom woke early, not because he had slept well, but because the thought of the barn had finally crowded out the shallow rest he had managed. The conversations from the day before replayed themselves in fragments, half-finished sentences, and careful pauses that said more than words. People had learned to live around this place, not with it. They had learned to look past it. The silence they carried was practiced, shaped by repetition. He dressed without turning on the lights and stepped outside while the air was still cool enough to carry the faint scent of wet earth. The barn stood where it always had, unchanged by rain or attention, its shape firm against the dull sky. It looked patient. That unsettled him more than anything else. Buildings that waited were rarely empty. Tom unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him. The interior greeted him with the same dry, dust-laden stillness he had come to expect. The sand lay as he had left it, its surface unbroken by settling or moisture. He set the flashlight on a beam and began working again. Slower now, more deliberate, his movements guided by the understanding that whatever he was uncovering had been hidden by design, not neglect. He dug deeper along the area where he had uncovered the clay-lined floor, widening the cleared space inch by inch. The work felt different now, less like excavation and more like trespass. Each shovelful seemed to cross an invisible boundary, one marked not by signs or locks, but by intent. The layers revealed themselves with increasing clarity, thin bands of variation that spoke of repeated returns, of someone standing where he now stood and making choices about how much to cover and when. The first object he uncovered was small, almost easy to miss. A corner of metal, dull and corroded, caught the edge of his shovel. He froze, then knelt carefully, using his hands to brush the sand away. The object emerged slowly, a rectangular box no larger than a suitcase, its surface eaten away by time, but its shape intact. There were no markings, no labels, no attempt to identify its contents. Tom stared at it for a long moment before touching it. When he did, the metal was cold beneath his fingers, heavier than it looked. He worked it free with effort, dragging it onto the cleared clay floor. It did not open easily. The latch resisted, stiff with rust, and when it finally gave way, it did so with a sound that made him flinch. Inside, there was nothing of value in the way he had hoped. No money, no jewelry, no documents neatly preserved. Instead, there were scraps of fabric, brittle and discolored, and fragments of paper reduced to pulp by time and pressure. He felt a wave of disappointment rise, and then falter as he realized what he was looking at. These were remnants, not possessions. Pieces of something that had once mattered enough to hide and had since been stripped of its usefulness. He closed the box and sat back, breathing slowly. One container could be dismissed as coincidence, a mistake, a forgotten storage decision made by someone else. But the way it had been placed, the care taken to surround it with layers of sand and wood, suggested otherwise. He dug again. The second container lay deeper, set beneath a newer layer of planks. This one was larger, its metal darker, its edges reinforced. It took him nearly an hour to uncover it fully, his hands shaking with fatigue and something closer to dread. When he opened it, the smell hit him first, faint but unmistakable. Old, trapped air carrying the residue of things that should not have been sealed away. Inside were personal items. A wallet, its leather stiff and cracked. A ring, plain and worn thin. A watch whose face had stopped long ago. Tom picked them up one by one, his throat tightening. These were not valuables. They were identifiers, things that belonged to people, not transactions. He sat there longer this time, the silence pressing in on him with a weight that made his chest ache. The barn no longer felt like a puzzle. It felt like a grave that had been disguised as storage. As he continued digging, the pattern became undeniable. Containers of different sizes, placed at different depths, some empty, some holding remnants, all surrounded by sand that had been carefully layered to preserve and conceal. The planks between layers were replaced periodically, newer wood resting atop older, as if maintenance had continued long after the initial act. Someone had returned here repeatedly, not to check on what was hidden, but to ensure it stayed hidden. The realization settled in slowly, its implications spreading outward like a stain. The sand was not filler. It was a tool. It absorbed moisture, muted sound, suppressed odor. It could be shifted easily, adjusted after each return, erased and reformed without leaving obvious traces. It was protection, not against the elements, but against discovery. Tom worked until his arms felt like they no longer belonged to him. The dust grew thicker, clinging to his hair, his skin, his clothes. His breathing grew shallow, his lungs burning with each breath. At one point, his vision blurred, and he had to sit down hard against the barn wall. Fighting the urge to retch, he stayed there until the world steadied, then forced himself back to his feet. He was not alone in this anymore. The sense of being watched crept in gradually, not as a clear fear, but as a tension that settled between his shoulder blades. He told himself it was exhaustion, that isolation did strange things to the mind. But when he stepped outside to drink water and noticed fresh tire tracks near the road, tracks that had not been there that morning, he felt his pulse quicken. That night, he secured the barn as best he could and returned to the house, locking the doors with more care than before. He ate little, his appetite dulled by what he had found. As darkness fell, he noticed a distant light flicker briefly near the edge of the property, then disappear. He stood at the window for a long time, staring out into the black, listening for sounds that never came. The pressure intensified over the following days. Tools went missing first. A shovel he had left leaning against the barn wall vanished overnight. Then a crowbar. He searched the property, certain he had simply misplaced them, but found nothing. When he replaced them, the replacements disappeared as well. Someone was entering the barn when he was not there, moving quietly, deliberately. One evening, as he worked late, the barn door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing sharply through the space. He rushed to it, his heart pounding, and found it barred from the outside. Panic surged, sudden and overwhelming. He shouted, his voice swallowed by the sand and wood. He pounded on the door until his hands ached, until the air felt thin and close. After what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than minutes, the bar was removed. The door opened. No one stood there. The farm lay silent, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. Tom stumbled outside, gasping, his knees weak. The message was clear enough. This was not a warning delivered by words. It was a demonstration. The offer came the next day. A man Tom did not recognize waited near the road when he drove back from town. He looked ordinary enough, his clothes unremarkable, his posture relaxed, in a way that suggested confidence rather than ease. He greeted Tom by name, as if they were already acquainted. "You're digging in the barn," the man said, not as a question. Tom did not respond. "You don't have to," the man continued. "Some things are better left as they are." "What things?" Tom asked. The man smiled slightly. "The past." He explained the proposal with practiced calm. Tom could stop digging. Replace the sand. Lock the barn and leave it alone. In return, he would receive a sum of money, delivered quietly, enough to ease his immediate financial concerns. Enough, Tom realized, to cover nearly half of his loan. "And if I don't?" Tom asked. The man shrugged. "Then things get complicated." "For you?" Tom watched him walk away, his steps unhurried, his presence lingering long after he disappeared down the road. The offer sat heavy in Tom's mind, its appeal undeniable. He had not come here to play investigator or moral judge. He had come to make money, to fix his life, to escape the slow grind of failure that had defined his recent years. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the numbers running through his head as insistently as the images of what he had found beneath the sand. The money would buy him time. Silence would cost him nothing he could not rationalize losing. The people connected to those objects were already gone. The past could not be undone. And yet, each time he closed his eyes, he saw the watch, the ring, the wallet, not as evidence, but as reminders that someone had once stood where he now stood and chosen to hide rather than confront. By morning, his indecision had hardened into something more dangerous than resolve. He returned to the barn with a grim focus, working faster, deeper, driven by the understanding that time had become his enemy. Each discovery reinforced what he already knew. This place had been used to erase people, not just objects. The sand had served as a weapon of quiet efficiency, turning absence into normalcy. As he uncovered the faint outline of human remains beneath one of the lowest layers, the truth settled fully into him, heavy and irreversible. Whatever wealth he had imagined lay hidden here had been an illusion. The real value of this place was not something that could be sold or leveraged. It was something that had been denied for years, buried under layers of effort and fear. When Tom stepped back into the daylight, his hands trembling, his clothes caked with sand, he understood that the cheap deal he had struck had come with a price far greater than interest and repayment schedules. He had crossed into a story that did not belong to him, and yet now demanded something from him all the same. The barn stood behind him, silent and unchanged, its contents still hidden beneath layers of carefully placed sand. But the weapon it had once been had lost its power, not because the truth was fully uncovered, but because it had been seen. And once seen, it could no longer be buried so easily. The rain returned without ceremony, as if it had never truly left. It began in the early hours of the morning, a low, steady drumming that crept into Tom's sleep and pulled him back to wakefulness with the persistence of an unanswered question. He lay still for a long moment, listening to it gather strength against the roof, feeling the house shift and sigh as moisture settled into old seams. The sound was different from the earlier storms. It lacked violence. It carried intent. By the time he rose and looked out through the kitchen window, the sky had collapsed into a uniform gray that erased distance and flattened the land. Water threaded its way across the fields in narrow channels, following paths it remembered better than any map. The river was already swollen, its surface moving faster than it should have, carrying branches and debris in a steady procession toward lower ground. Tom felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the kind that came when events began to move without waiting for his permission. He checked his phone and found a missed call from the bank, followed by a short message reminding him of the payment due within the week. The timing was not coincidental, only indifferent. Obligations did not pause for weather, and banks did not concern themselves with context. He deleted the message without responding and pulled on his boots. The barn called to him with a clarity that left no room for debate. Whatever decision he made, it would be made there, not at a desk or over a phone call. He stepped outside and walked into the rain, letting it soak through his jacket, past the surface discomfort, and into something colder. The ground near the barn was already slick, the clay beneath the grass turning treacherous underfoot. Water pooled around the foundation, shallow but insistent, testing weaknesses the way it always did. Tom unlocked the door and stepped inside, his boots leaving wet prints on the sand-packed floor. The interior felt different immediately. The air was heavier, tinged with dampness, despite the sand's resistance. He switched on his flashlight and swept the beam across the cleared sections he had worked so hard to expose. The containers lay where he had left them, partially uncovered, their presence no longer abstract. They were here. They were real. And now they were at risk. The rain intensified as the morning wore on. It beat against the barn's roof and walls with increasing urgency, each impact echoing faintly through the structure. Tom worked quickly, his movement stripped of hesitation. He did not attempt to excavate further. He focused instead on what he could save. Evidence. Proof. The weight of what he had uncovered pressed on him, urging efficiency over thoroughness. He hauled the smaller containers toward the door, his muscles screaming in protest. The sand shifted underfoot, no longer the stable surface it had been. Moisture crept in despite the design, not enough to soak through entirely, but enough to alter the balance. Each step required care. Each lift felt heavier than the last. At some point, he became aware of a new sound beneath the rain. A low, groaning creak that rose from the barn's foundation and settled into his bones. He froze, listening. The sound came again, longer this time, followed by a faint crack that ran along the clay-lined floor like a warning. The river had reached the rise. Tom moved faster. He dragged a container free and staggered toward the door, setting it just outside beneath the overhang. The rain soaked it instantly, water beating and running along rusted seams. He turned back inside without pausing, his breath coming in sharp bursts. The flashlight beam trembled in his hand, skittering across sand and wood. The water reached his boots next, seeping in at ground level, cold and relentless. It pooled around his ankles, then rose to his shins, each inch stealing balance and time. The sand responded immediately, loosening, shifting under pressure. What had once absorbed and concealed now threatened to betray. Tom waded deeper into the barn, reaching the area where he had uncovered the deepest layer. The outline of remains lay just beneath the surface, fragile and incomplete. He hesitated, his mind caught between urgency and reverence. He could not move everything. He knew that now. He could only choose. Another crack split the air, louder than before. The barn shuddered, dust and sand raining down from the beams. Tom forced himself to act. He marked the spot as best he could, driving a piece of wood into the clay, tying a strip of fabric around it. It wasn't enough. It would have to be. The water rose to his knees, pushing harder now, driven by the river's weight. The barn's door strained against its hinges as wind and rain combined, pressing from both sides. Tom struggled back toward the exit, dragging one final container behind him. His legs burned with effort, the current pulling insistently, eager to reclaim what had been hidden for so long. As he reached the threshold, the barn gave a sound that no building should make, a deep, splitting groan that carried finality. Tom stumbled outside, falling hard onto the wet ground as the door slammed shut behind him of its own accord. He rolled onto his side, gasping, the rain blurring his vision. The collapse came moments later. The barn's foundation failed first, undermined by water that had waited patiently for this opportunity. The structure shuddered and then folded inward, beams snapping, walls bowing before giving way entirely. Sand poured out in a pale torrent, mixing with mud and floodwater in a rushing cascade that erased edges and distinctions. Containers vanished beneath the surge, some carried away, others swallowed whole. Tom lay there, helpless, as the place that had held its secret for decades unraveled in seconds. The sound was overwhelming, a roar that drowned out thought, a violence that felt both sudden and overdue. When it ended, the barn was no longer a structure, but a heap of broken wood and sand, already reshaping itself under the influence of water. He pushed himself up slowly, his body shaking, his clothes soaked and heavy. The river had breached the rise completely now, water spreading across the ground where the barn had stood. The markers he had placed were gone, torn free and scattered. The sand that had once been a weapon lay exposed, indistinguishable from the flood's debris. Tom stood there until the rain softened, until the destruction settled into a new, terrible stillness. He felt empty in a way he had not anticipated, not relieved, not triumphant, simply hollow, as if the effort and fear had carved something out of him and left nothing in its place. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He ignored it at first, then pulled it free with numb fingers. Another message from the bank, another reminder, another expression of urgency that now felt grotesquely small. He laughed once, a short, harsh sound that was quickly swallowed by the rain. The payment no longer mattered in the way it had. The numbers he had once clung to had lost their power, stripped of meaning by what he had seen and failed to save. As the rain eased into a steady drizzle, headlights appeared on the road. Then another set. Vehicles slowed, stopped. People emerged, drawn by the sound, by instinct, by curiosity. Tom did not move to meet them. He stood where he was, mud-streaked and shaking, watching as the consequences of long-buried choices surfaced at last. The second flood had done what the first had not. It had not concealed. It had revealed. Not cleanly, not completely, but enough. Enough to make denial impossible. When authorities arrived later that day, their questions fell around Tom like distant thunder. He answered what he could, showed them what remained, pointed to where the barn had stood, where the sand had been layered, where he had found the containers before the water took them back. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, steady and detached, as if it belonged to someone else. As night fell and the rain finally ceased, the farm lay transformed once again. The barn was gone. The sand was gone. The illusion of containment had dissolved, leaving only aftermath. Tom sat on the steps of the house, wrapped in a blanket someone had given him, staring out at the darkened land. He thought of the offer he had been given, the money that could have bought silence, the escape he might have chosen. He thought of the people who had learned to forget, who had lived their lives around absence. The flood had taken his leverage, his bargaining position, his imagined profit. It had taken the weapon and shattered it beyond repair. What remained was not an opportunity, but a reckoning. And as exhaustion finally claimed him, Tom understood that whatever came next would no longer be his to control. The water had decided that for him. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale and exhausted, as if the sky itself had not yet decided whether the storm was truly over. Tom woke on the couch in the farmhouse, wrapped in a coarse blanket that smelled faintly of damp wool and chujich rook. For a moment, he did not remember where he was or why his body felt so heavy, every joint aching, as though he had been carrying weight long after he should have put it down. Then the images returned, slow and relentless. The barn folding inward, the sand pouring out like something alive, the sound of wood breaking under water that had waited patiently for its moment. He sat up and listened. The house was quiet, but not empty. Somewhere beyond the walls, engines murmured, doors opened and closed. Voices rose and fell in tones too measured to belong to neighbors. The world had come to the farm at last, not with curiosity, but with purpose. Tom stood and went to the window. The land beyond looked unfamiliar, reshaped again by water and movement. Where the barn had stood, there was now only a broad, raw scar of mud and debris, marked by stakes and tape. Trucks were parked along the road. Men and women in dark jackets moved deliberately across the property, stopping, pointing, making notes. Official attention had a weight of its own, heavier in some ways than threat. He washed his face at the sink, watching muddy water swirl down the drain, and changed into dry clothes someone had brought him the night before. As he stepped outside, a man approached, introducing himself in the practiced tone of someone accustomed to delivering questions rather than answers. Tom listened, nodded, responded when asked. He did not embellish. He did not withhold. There was a strange relief in that, in letting the facts exist without shaping them to his advantage. They walked the property together, stopping where the barn had been, where the sand had spilled and been carried away again by the flood. Tom pointed out what he could remember, where containers had been found, where layers had been replaced over time, where the floor had been sealed against water. He showed them the papers he had gathered, the records that hinted at operations no one wanted to claim responsibility for. Each detail was received, recorded, absorbed into a process that no longer belonged to him. By midday, the farm was no longer his in any meaningful sense. Notices were posted. Boundaries were redrawn. The land was declared part of an active investigation. When the words were spoken aloud, Tom felt a quiet finality settle over him. He had known this was coming, had accepted it even before the barn collapsed. Ownership had been provisional from the moment he chose not to look away. The bank called again that afternoon. This time, Tom answered. The voice on the other end was professional, carefully neutral, explaining that given the circumstances, the property would be repossessed, pending further review. There were terms and clauses, references to insurance, to force majeure, to obligations that had not disappeared simply because the ground had shifted beneath them. Tom listened without interruption. When the call ended, he felt something loosen inside him. The fear he had carried since signing the loan papers, the fear of numbers and deadlines and compounded interest, had lost its sharpness. The worst had already happened. Everything else was detail. He spent the rest of the day packing what little he had brought with him. There was not much to take. A few clothes, some tools that had survived, the papers he had copied. As he moved through the house, he became aware of how little he had ever intended to stay. The rooms had never been more than shelter, the land never more than leverage. It was only now, as he prepared to leave, that the place felt real, grounded by consequence rather than calculation. In the days that followed, the story unfolded without him at its center. Though his name appeared often enough in reports and statements, the investigation expanded outward, touching old businesses, former officials, people who had learned to keep their memories compartmentalized. Some were cooperative, others were not. Names surfaced that had been spoken with respect in town, now spoken carefully, with qualifiers attached. Tom was called in more than once to recount what he had found, to clarify timelines, to confirm details. Each time he told the same story, resisting the urge to smooth its edges. He learned quickly that truth did not need embellishment to carry weight. It needed consistency. Weeks passed. The farm remained cordoned off, transformed from a failed investment into a place of interest and scrutiny. Tom moved on in the most literal sense, staying in borrowed rooms, working short-term jobs to cover basic expenses. There were moments when regret surfaced unexpectedly, not for what he had lost, but for what might have been easier had he chosen silence. The offer that had been made to him returned in his thoughts more than once, tempting in hindsight with its simplicity. But those moments passed. They always did. One afternoon, he received a letter informing him that due to his cooperation and the circumstances surrounding the property, the remaining balance of his loan would be addressed through legal channels connected to the investigation. It was not a reward. It was not compensation. It was a resolution. The debt that had driven his decision-making for months loosened its grip at last, not through profit, but through consequence. He sat with the letter for a long time, turning it over in his hands, feeling its weight. The numbers printed there no longer carried the power they once had. They marked an ending, not a promise. When the case finally moved into the public eye, Tom watched from a distance. He did not attend the proceedings. He read about them instead, following the steady unraveling of a story that had relied on neglect and silence for far too long. The sand-filled barn became a detail in that story, a method rather than a mystery. The flood, once dismissed as an act of nature, was re-examined as opportunity, as cover. Tom understood then what the cheap purchase had truly cost him. Not money, not time, not even safety. It had cost him the illusion that control could be bought, that risk could be managed purely through calculation. He had entered the deal believing that the world was a series of problems to be solved in the right order. He left it knowing that some problems waited patiently for someone willing to see them. On his last evening near the farm, Tom returned to the edge of the property. The sun was low, casting long shadows across land that no longer belonged to anyone in the way it once had. The scar where the barn had stood was still visible, though grass had already begun the slow work of reclaiming it. Nature, he realized, did not erase so much as it layered, much like the sand had done. He stood there until the light faded, hands in his pockets, feeling neither triumph nor defeat. The man who had arrived here looking for profit would have measured the outcome differently. He would have tallied losses, cursed bad luck, searched for someone to blame. That man still existed somewhere inside him, but quieter now, tempered by what had followed. Tom turned away at last and walked back toward the road, carrying nothing with him that could be taken or sold. The cheap deal was over. The reckoning it had purchased would continue without him. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. Watch the next video and explore the other stories already waiting here. Share this video with someone who needs to see it.